Welcome to the 15th in our session on Middle Eastern Islamic history. This is going to be a section on the Ilkhanate and Tamerlane. And the rules for those of you who are not familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, theology, or any of the other things that we're going to be discussing. I'm a layperson, and I will endeavor to provide a secular perspective on this kind of history. I would ask that because the sensitivity of the subjects, please be respectful. And despite that, I do want people to make questions, comments, and clarifications throughout the presentation. Please do interact, and we can enjoy learning together. Now, this session will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. And finally, like the other 14 sessions, which have been graciously hosted on Omnicarta, which is Zach's website. All these are recorded. You can watch them later. You can catch up on previous lectures and just go through the series at your own pleasure. So let's begin with our famous quiz. Every session starts with a quiz on what we remember from the previous lecture. And so here is our first question. Which of the following are tactics that the Mongols use? Choose all that apply.
A is wrong.
Okay, B is wrong.
Okay.
E is correct.
Yeah.
C is correct. Hang on. Yep. C is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Or hang on. From Baghdad, Georgia? That's interesting. Okay. I think you mentioned B as well. This is tricky. I'm just watching the video now from last week.
Yeah, no, it is a little tricky. A is true. C is true. And E is true. So one of the things that separates Genghis Khan from a lot of the other nomadic groups that we've seen is that what Genghis Khan did is that he found almost all of these Mongol troops, Mongol ethnic groups fighting each other. And what he did is when he created his military organizations, he put all the different tribes together in singular units to prevent them from having an ethnic nature to any particular tumen or division of 10,000 soldiers. This way that it created a unified Mongolic identity. So that was definitely one of his actions. There were some tribes that he didn't break up because they were incredibly loyal to him, but almost all of the tribes he did break up. The next is that Mongols did not fight as a singular fighting column. They would have numerous different forces in the battle at the same time. They might have one group at the city, besieging the city. They might have another group in the hinterland attacking the farmers. They might have another column coming in from the desert. So they divided their forces very effectively. There are often cases, for example, where Genghis will send some of his generals far out where they would have to make their own decisions in real time because the lines of communication would be that difficult to maintain over that kind of distance. C is correct. Georgia was under the Bagratid dynasty pretty much since it's one of the longest surviving dynasties in world history. It was over 1,000 years that dynasty survived until Georgia was conquered by Russia. You had mangonels coming from Jin China. You had heavy cavalry from Georgia. The Mongols integrated the specialized soldiers from the areas that they conquered into their military. And that was a huge part of how they were able to be successful. D is false. The Mongols absolutely compensated the families of those who died, which gave the Mongols the reason to fight to the death because they knew that their families would be protected even if they did die. And E is correct. We talked about the tactics the Mongols used in order to defeat their enemies, and it's that recursive bow, giving them longer range and more deadly accuracy, and the feint attack, which allowed them to split off sections of the enemy armies and take them piece by piece. All right, question number 2. Which 3 of the following are accurate reasons why most Khwarezm and Khorasan became severely depopulated?
D sounds right.
Yeah, D.
E looks wrong. F sounds correct to me. Go back to A. Muslims are not allowed to commit suicide, are they?
Um,
I'm looking at A there.
Correct. Muslims are not allowed to commit suicide. The suicide bombers that we have today are people who are acting in the case of, at least in their belief, in the case of martyrdom, not in the case of suicide.
So maybe what you said is D and F is correct, right? Did you guys say that? D and
I think F is absolutely correct.
And we do know that Jarl did retrieve to India first, right? Maybe
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. It's C, D, and F, right?
Hey, that's the first one for me. All three.
Nice.
But it shows you, Richard. I don't read them in advance.
Well, I mean, you would know by reading them in advance. You would, like, I guess if you did that and then you opened up a book, but like I don't have it highlighted on my side. So yeah, basically, we don't have the mass suicide. We don't have Al-Adi Muhammad setting fire to cities. All right, question number 3. What was the purpose of the Semerin? These are officials from other areas of the empire, like you have Chinese in Persia and Persians in China.
Is that C correct?
C is absolutely correct. That was the goal. The goal was to create a set of bureaucrats that were not empowered by local individuals, but would require the Mongols for their survival, and therefore they couldn't be disloyal to the Mongols, right? Answer B is false, because even though the Mongols had a sense of religious pluralism and diversity, they weren't interested in the active proselytization of new faiths or creating religious diversity. They just sort of respected what there was, especially if those people of those religions could pray to their god to ensure Mongol success. D is false, because there's no way that the Semerin would replace the populations that they exterminated. We're talking about 1 to every like 10,000 was the ratio of the kind of people that they brought over. So there's no way that they would replace anybody. And there was not a unified bureaucracy across the Mongolic world. Bureaucracy was very different in different places, and generally speaking, the new individuals fit into the system that had previously existed, that the Mongols sort of jerry-rigged together.
So, Richard.
Sure.
So, is the Chinese place in Persian also called Semerin?
Semerin was the term
I know the Persian place in China called Semerin, and the meaning is colored eye, because they have the blue eye. So Correct. They call Semerin. But I'm not sure they call Chinese in Persian Semerin, because that's a black eye. I don't know if one can see that.
Right. No, the thing is that the title Semerin was taken from the Chinese, but integrated into the Mongolic power structure. So the Persians would use this term, Semerin, but they didn't know what the meaning of the word was, right? They wouldn't know the etymology for it.
So Persian call it the Semerin because Chinese call it the Semerin.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, because that means the color eye people. Okay. So,
no, one of the things that is very interesting, if we look at trying to understand what Persians understood of the Chinese bureaucratic techniques that the Mongols brought with them, in many cases they couldn't distinguish, for example, the difference between a person's name and their rank, because they weren't familiar with any of these titles or ranks. So there are many cases where we have something, and it's only in the last 30 years that you have sinologists looking over documents that have been translated from Persian to English, and they're saying, wait, that looks like this Chinese word, which is this particular rank. This is not the name of a person. This is their title. So you can imagine in the earlier period, they would have just used these titles without even thinking about it. All right, question number 3. Despite the fact that the Khwarezm Shah Jalaluddin Maghboni reconstituted an empire by 1228, why was he defeated so soon in 1231?
It's a D.
D is correct. So we know that Berke Khan did try to launch invasions from the Caucasus, but not in this time period. That would happen about 20 to 30 years later. Genghis Khan was already dead by 1227, so he couldn't have done this in 1228. The Aldiguzid, Shirvanshahs, and Georgians were conquered, and they certainly revolted around the time that Şauma Khan invaded, but they did not reach out for an alliance. And D is correct that the Sultans of Rum, the Ayyubids, and the Armenians fought him at the Battle of Yasichamon. Once he had been defeated, the Mongol Şauma Khan was able to take advantage and press him into the mountains, where he lost the majority of his soldiers and was assassinated by a Kurdish militant. Question number 4. Which of the following Middle Eastern states was not conquered or allied with Hülegu Khan?
Well, C.
Yeah, that's it. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was the key enemy of Hülegu Khan. The other states were either vassals, allies, or were conquered by the time that he was in power, or by him. Last time we discussed the conquest of Central Asia and into the Mongol territories. And so we had these first 2 waves of invasion, right? The first wave was Genghis Khan himself in 1219 to 1221. And as you can see from the map, he moved throughout Khwarezm and Khorasan regions. And he and his sons were responsible for the destruction of those regions to a very strong degree, almost a genocidal degree. And we had severe depopulation, the destruction of the Ilkhanate, these water channels that allowed for large-scale irrigation and farming. And then the area was sort of ignored for about a decade. And then in 1231, we have this invasion by Şauma Khan, and he was able to defeat the western side of Persia, moving into the rest of the Middle East. And he was succeeded by Bajun, right? And the 2 of them, over the period from 1231, let's say, until 1245, they're responsible for sort of pacifying the western side of Persia, the eastern side of Anatolia, and the beginnings of the Levant region. Bajun, of course, won that key battle of Kızıldag in 1243, which effectively turned the Seljuk Empire, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, into a number of vassal states that would eventually succumb to Mongol power. And now we get to sort of that third wave of invasion that we discussed last time, which starts in 1251. So we really have to set the stage about where we are. In 1251, Möngke Khan becomes the leader of the Mongol Empire, and you can see the size and scale of the Mongol Empire when he ascends. Most of the new territories that had recently been added under his predecessor Hülegu Khan were the ones in Russia, which is why you have all those city-states that are vassals in the Russian side. And when Möngke was becoming the Great Khan, he had a Kurultai, right? He had this great meeting of the Mongol leaders. This is how the Mongols transitioned between figures in power, and the Kurultai was electing Möngke, but it didn't just do that. There were other events that took place, and one of those is that you had petitions from the peoples who were subject to the empire, non-Mongol peoples who were in that control. And one of these people was Mustafa Qazvini, Hamdallah Mustafa Qazvini, who was a cleric from the city of Qazvin in Iran. Qazvin is particularly close to the borders of the Ismaili state, right? The assassin state based in the fortress of Alamut. And he made a petition to Möngke when Möngke had risen to the level of Khan. You can see petitioners before Möngke Khan in the middle picture. And Mustafa Qazvini, his argument was that the Ismailis and other factional disputes within Iran were hurting the Iranian people, that they were suffering, and that the Khan should bring his way of justice, his strength of arms to Persia, create a organized governmental system, so that way peace and prosperity could rule in the region. in 1251, Möngke Khan, as I said, becomes elected Great Khan. And after listening to this petition and the petitions of a number of other officials from throughout the Mongol Empire, he sends his two brothers to take care of the major problems that the empire is facing, right? If we look at the map of when Möngke Khan ascended, we can notice that the two territories that the Mongols really wanted to expand into were southern China and Mesopotamia. So those were the two places to which the other brothers were sent. Hülegu Khan was sent to Mesopotamia and Persia, and Kublai was sent to China to conquer the southern Song dynasty.
Richard, I have a little bit concern here. So you said during this time the Mongol Khan, right, become the Great Khan of Mongol Empire.
Yes.
That means like other other state, how do you call it? The other like a golden horde is not existing anymore.
The golden horde, the golden horde doesn't exist yet, right? I'm sort of
before that time.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I think the Kublai is his younger brother, right?
Yes, exactly. Möngke was the oldest brother, and Hülegu and Kublai were younger brothers.
Who has a higher title, Kublai or Mongol?
While Möngke was alive, he died in the year 1259. While Möngke was alive, the 8 years that he was the Great Khan, he had a higher title, but he died in 1259, and so Kublai succeeded him as Great Khan, and he held that title until 1291 when he died.
So when Kublai was in China as an emperor, he also take the title of a Great Khan for the entire Mongol tribe, entire Mongol empire.
That's correct. Now, there are questions because of the wars of succession in the Mongol Empire as to whether all the other lesser Khans recognized that he was the Great Khan, but that was the title he held.
So he held the Great Khan after Mongol died.
Exactly that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when Kublai in China, he's still considered as under his older brother.
Yes.
Okay.
So now when we look at what Hülegu did, and we did sort of a step-by-step of that last week, but to really point out the highlights and sort of give you the Persian perspective as we're moving into this. And I want to thank a good friend of mine, Rob Shamir, for really working through with me some of the Persian sources. So Hülegu Khan, when he entered Iran, he really wanted to create a unified Iranic government. And this was something that a lot of Persians were on board with. One thing that I want to point out is that, right, these are maps that we've all seen before from the previous lectures, and I've dated them in terms of when they were. And you can notice something very clear in all of these maps, which is that the territory of the modern country of Iran, or if we look even bigger, what's called Greater Iran, all the areas that are sort of in the Iranic cultural sphere, were divided between numerous smaller states, smaller Abaqa, smaller emirates of different warring factions. And so Iran had been a place of disunity pretty much since the early 800s, when the Tahirids broke free of the Abbasid Caliphate. And Iran was on the precipice of being united by Hülegu Khan. And so when Hülegu said, those who give me military men, food, equipment, and transport, you will be part of the Iranic state and you will have peace and security. And those who do not provide me this, as soon as I am done with the Ismaili threat, I will deal with you. This created a huge wellspring of optimism and hopefulness in the Iranic world, because for the first time, there wouldn't be this large-scale divided imperial structure, right? So if we remember, the Khwarezmians had a large diversity in terms of the military that they could bring to bear, and while the Mongols had light horse archers, the Persians really provided a large amount of artillery and not artillery, infantry and heavy cavalry, as well as siege engines that could be used in further attacks. So the Persian forces that Hülegu was able to bring to his banner were a perfect complement to the Mongol tumens, the 100,000 soldiers that he was given by Möngke Khan to deal with the Ismaili problem that Hamdallah Qazvini, Mustafa Qazvini, brought to his attention. So if we go back to what Hülegu Khan was doing, the first thing he did, right, is he attacked the Lurs. And then after attacking the Lurs, he moved against the assassins by bombarding their fortresses. And if you look on the center left-hand side, you can see Hülegu Khan taking the fortress at Alamut, which was the key fortress held by the assassins, which is the military order of the Ismaili state. And Rukn ad-Din, who was the leader of the assassins at that time, surrendered to Hülegu, and even requested permission to go to Möngke, to surrender to Möngke, including all of his fortresses. Some of them didn't agree once Rukn ad-Din surrendered, and so they continued fighting. But by and large, the Ismailis were eliminated as a factional element by Hülegu Khan. One of the important things to realize is that by this point, Hülegu is seen by many Persians to be a Persian king, in the sense that he is a king of Persia, even though he is ethnic Mongol. And you can see in his court, in the upper right-hand side, you can see on the left-hand side of Hülegu are his Mongol advisors, and on the right-hand side of Hülegu are his Persian and Chinese advisors. Because Hülegu Khan had a very diverse court, ruling as a Mongol in Persia. Now, when he moved against Baghdad, that was the next move that he made. He requested the surrender of the caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Abbasid Caliph did not surrender. But Hülegu then besieged the city, and he was using for his main artillery battering Ğazan Khan, who was a Chinese siege organizer and engineer from Jin, China. And Ğazan Khan actually became the first governor of Baghdad for about a year before it was given to Juvaini. We're going to talk about Juvaini in a little bit. Hülegu Khan, as we mentioned last time, also then pressed his attack onto the Levant region. He won stunning victories at Aleppo and at Damascus, and even sent soldiers as far south to create a garrison as Gaza. Baybars, the Mamluk, you can see him in the lower left-hand side, was able to defeat the remaining forces of Hülegu Khan in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut, which prevented the Ilkhanate from holding any of these Levantine territories. And in the subsequent years, Baybars was able to reclaim most of the Levant up to the Euphrates from Hülegu Khan. Now, the reason why Baybars was able to defeat them is that the majority of Hülegu's forces had retreated from the region, and they retreated from the region because in 1259 Möngke Khan had died, right? So Hülegu had to go back to Karakorum for the Kurultai. This is the Kurultai that would appoint Kublai as the Great Khan. And when Hülegu returned, he was not able to press his claim to those regions because the Mamluks had fortified their defenses, and there was the beginnings of a civil war in the Mongol world. Now, in terms of Hülegu's cultural and philosophical tastes, I just wanted to draw your attention to two specific individuals. On the right side, we have Atamalik Juvaini. Juvaini was a Persian official and Grand Vizier, but he was also a historian. And so he actually participated in the attacks on the fortress at Alamut and several other of Hülegu Khan's campaigns. So he gives us a first-person account of those campaigns. He also wrote the story of Genghis Khan, which was called Tarikh Jahan Gusha, meaning the history of the world conqueror. And Juvayni is one of our best sources from the time of what the armies looked like that went through Persia. If you remember from last time when we talked about the destruction of Merv, it was Atamalik Juvayni who wrote about how Merv was destroyed so completely and so utterly. On the left-hand side, we have Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi. And when Hülegu Khan entered Iran, he established a capital there for at least his functional use at Maraghe, which is in the northwestern region of Iran today. And in Maraghe, he built a observatory for the stars in the heavens. And Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi was responsible for charting a number of the paths and orbits of items in the night sky and coming up with scientific theses about astronomical developments. And of course, like most people from his age, he was also a polymath. He did research into math and a number of other scientific disciplines, but astronomy is what he is best known for. And the Iranian government, in order to preserve the history of this period, even today has an observatory at Maraghe. Of course, it's more modern in its technological standing, but it's a continuing legacy of Hülegu Khan in modern Iran. So by 1262, when Kublai Khan had really been asserted as the Great Khan, the Mongol Empire had sort of divided into 5 different sections in terms of its functional workings, right? The Great Khan had nominal power over all of these, but not actual physical power. He had de jure power, not de facto power. And the Great Khan, of course, was the head of the Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai. But you also have these other entities, the Golden Horde, the White Horde, the Chagatai, and the Ilkhan. Now, the term Ilkhan actually is a Mongol term, and it refers to a Khan who considers himself subordinate to the Great Khan. Only Hülegu took the title Ilkhan. The other Khans did not want to take that title, did not want to recognize the superiority of Kublai's claim. But ironically, because the Persian government was the only one to accept without reservation the sovereignty of the Yuan dynasty as the Great Khan, the term Ilkhanate almost exclusively refers to the Persian Mongolic state.
So is this the same Hulegu Khan that's portrayed in Marco Polo series?
In Marco Polo, Hülegu Khan doesn't exist, like the TV series, right. Because he's dead by the time of the show.
Oh, it's Kublai, yeah, right, Kublai.
He's referenced in the show once or twice, but he doesn't actually make an appearance.
Got it.
I want to read a comment that from somebody. A famous joke was made about Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi. He was in Baghdad years before its fall in 1258, and one Baghdadi scientist joked with him, "Are you among the cows of Tus or the donkeys?" And when Tusi came back to Baghdad with Hülegu, he saw the same guy in captivity and told him, "Now you see, I am among the cows of Tus," and pointed to Hülegu and said, "He is my horn." Basically saying that he chose the right side. He chose to stick with Hülegu Khan, and therefore he was protected by Hülegu Khan, whereas this Baghdadi scientist chose to stay with the Abbasid Caliphate and went the way of the Abbasid Caliphate. You can then see that the Golden Horde absorbs the White Horde, so there ends up really being 4 distinct entities, right? The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty. And you can see where each of these entities comes in terms of the descendants of Genghis Khan. The Golden Horde comes out of Berke and Berke's line. The Chagatai Khanate comes out of Chagatai. The Yuan dynasty comes from Kublai. And the Ilkhanate comes from Hülegu and his descendants.
Oh, Richard, I have one more question. Do you know how many Ismailis there were assassins that were there that were taken over by Hulegu?
I mean, we're probably talking about a few thousand. The Ismailis were not that numerous in terms of how many of them could fight. But the thing is, their fortresses were so well ensconced in the mountains and so remote that it was almost impossible to take them, which is why it required such large Mongol forces to really bring them down, and that none of the great Seljuks could do it. In fact, many of the great Seljuks relied on Ismaili forces as sort of a third column in their army, in addition to the Persians and Turks that were already fighting.
Right.
So, as we mentioned, the separation of the Mongol Empire into these four entities, and the accession of Kublai to the Great Khan position was something that ended up shattering the unity of the Mongol states. So Arikbeke, who is the younger brother of Kublai, was supported in his attempt to become Great Khan by Berke Khan of the Golden Horde. And so the two of them unified, along with the Chagatai family, against Hülegu and Kublai, who supported each other. So as part of this, relations between Berke Khan and Hülegu Khan really soured around 1261, 1262. So there are a number of reasons why Berke Khan ended up going to war with Hülegu. Some of them include the fact that when Hülegu marched in Persia, there were three Jochid princes who were cousins or brothers of Berke Khan, who died during those campaigns, and Hülegu wasn't seen to have properly protected them because of the way the military was divided, and that Berke Khan conquered Russia, which was not very wealthy, whereas Hülegu and Kublai were conquering much more wealthy sedentary civilizations. The war booty was not spread equally. Berke Khan also converted to Islam, and so Hülegu's destruction of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate was seen as a religious grievance for Berke Khan. You can even see in the picture of Berke Khan that he has the Islamic writing on his pauldron saying, the prophet of God is Muhammad. And he had strong relationships with the Mamluks. The Mamluks in Egypt required a consistent importation of Cuman and Circassian Turkic peoples that they could buy and incorporate into the Mamluk soldier corps. And those people were coming from territories within the Golden Horde. So the Golden Horde made money capturing and selling these slaves. So they need to, and the Ilkhans were against the Mamluks, which hurt relations between the Ilkhanates and the Golden Horde. And finally, these Kurultai disagreements that I pointed out, where Berke Khan supported Arikbeke against Kublai. So there were a number of skirmishes between these two forces, but relatively speaking, they were of equal size. And so of the battles, probably the most decisive one was the Battle of the Terek River. You can see the Terek River in the zoomed in portion. It's in the northern Caucasus on the Russian side of the border today. And the Battle of the Terek River was a victory for Hülegu, but he couldn't really press much more than he had won in that battle. So by and large, when Hülegu Khan died in 1265, the war wasn't over. And so it went into the reign of Abaqa Khan. And Abaqa was Hülegu's son, and he considered himself now the Ilkhan of the Ilkhanate, this Perso-Mongolic empire, and that was sort of his orientation. So the first thing he wanted to do was finish the wars of his father. So he came to peace with Berke Khan in 1267, and he also laid siege to the final Ismaili castles that refused to surrender when the Rukn ad-Din, the head of the Ismaili order, had surrendered to Möngke Khan, and these renegade Ismailis had not accepted that surrender. The final castle to fall was Gedku, which fell in the year 1270. And you can see in the lower left-hand side sort of a stylized drawing of the Mongols besieging that fortress. Gedku is one of the few Ismaili fortresses that were not completely dismembered by the Mongols. And so you can actually see on top of the mountain today the fortress that was there. This is not a reconstruction, that is the actual fortress that just survived. And you can see how steep the hill is, how difficult it would be to besiege such a place. Ilkhan Abaqa religiously was still a Buddhist. And so he had no compunction about whether or not he was going to support different religions or different faiths within his borders. We have to remember, of course, that his mother was a Christian, an Nestorian Christian, and Abaqa Khan saw no issue with building numerous churches throughout the kingdom. Neither did he see a problem with building mosques as well. However, Abaqa Khan had a lot to deal with on his plate because it wasn't just the Golden Horde that was attacking him, it was also the Chagatai in Central Asia who were attacking him. And there were numerous invasions from 1270 to 1271 that he had to fend off. He also had attacks from the Mamluks in the south, and the Mamluks had created an alliance with the Golden Horde, that if the Golden Horde were under attack, the Mamluks would attack, and then conversely, if the Mamluks were under attack, the Golden Horde would attack. So that way they could get the Ilkhanate between them in sort of a pincer movement. In particular, Sultan Baybars crossed the Euphrates, right, that border in Syria between the Ilkhanate on the eastern bank and the Mamluk Sultanate on the western bank, and came into what's now modern Turkey, to the city of Elbistan. You can see it here. Baybars had developed a very good system in terms of figuring out when Mongols would advance across the Euphrates River. He created a number of signposts, got local Bedouins involved in the surveillance, and had maneuvers taught to all of the people at those guard posts of what should happen if an Ilkhan force penetrated, which resulted in Baybars having a very effective border with the Ilkhanate. And so Baybars was able to take advantage of internal disagreements within the Ilkhanate to try and weaken it. One in particular was that there was a vizier of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Now remember, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was the government in Anatolia, and they had surrendered to the Mongols in 1243 after the Battle of Kızıldag and had become vassals. But the Grand Vizier Parvane of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was not happy with the Mongols and was always worried that he would lose his position or that they would demote him. So he decided to play both sides at the same time. He sent requests for help from Abaqa Khan and from Baybars in order to try and get them to fight each other and then perhaps try and get his freedom. And so you can see at first Baybars invades Cilicia in 1265 and then comes back. But in 1277, he moves all the way to Elbistan, wins a stunning victory against the forces of Abaqa Khan, then moves to Kayseri, sacks the city of Kayseri, and then returns to Syria because he knows that he cannot hold this territory. Parvane tries to maintain whatever quasi-independence he might have. And in fact, during the Battle of Elbistan, he was expected to fight on the side of Abaqa Khan, but he didn't. And his neutrality would cost him his life because Abaqa Khan was so angry at how ineffective the Mongol resistance had been to Baybars that he pursued anybody he could around the country, and even had to be told by his generals that he shouldn't just massacre the entire population of what's now Eastern Turkey in revenge. Another thing that Abaqa Khan was involved with was the Ninth Crusade. Now, Abaqa Khan was very interested in getting crusaders to fight against the Mamluks. He was interested in having any allies he could against the Mamluks. Those were his chief rivals and threats. And so, as we talked about 2 sessions ago, Edward Longshanks invaded from Acre, but he couldn't coordinate effectively with Abaqa Khan. Abaqa, in fact, didn't fight here directly. He sent one of his generals, Samagar, with 1 tumen, 10,000 men, because he couldn't spare anymore, given the problems with Berke Khan in the north and the problems with the Chagatai Khanate in the east. So because the inability of the Mongols to coordinate with the Crusaders, and because of the inability from Abaqa Khan to send as many troops as he would have otherwise liked to, the Ninth Crusade was generally seen as a failure and didn't improve the Mongol position vis-a-vis the Mamluks. The reigns of Hülegu Khan and Abaqa Khan, as much militarism as there was during their rule, were generally seen as unified, peaceful periods by the majority of Persians. The economy was doing relatively well domestically, and Hülegu Khan and Abaqa Khan had tried to rebuild some of the cities that had been destroyed during their fighting. For example, Hülegu Khan spent monies to repair Baghdad and to at least make it a functional city. It never reached its pre-attack population, but it was a functioning city once again. Abaqa Khan did very similar things in the eastern parts of the empire. So Persians were generally fans of this empire until about 1282, when you started to have a period of instability. In this period of instability, you have Teguder becoming the first Ilkhan to convert to Islam, and who was a genuine believer, at least we believe, in Islam. The majority of the Mongol court was furious about the conversion, and so there was a civil war. Atamalik Juvayni became one of the chief advisors for Teguder, and you can see his brother Shamsuddin Juvayni with Teguder coming up with battle strategies. In 1284, forces loyal to Arghun, Teguder's brother, captured Teguder and had him executed. And so Arghun became the Ilkhan of the caliphate, and he was there with his wife Kutlug Khantum. Arghun was a Lamaist Buddhist, and he was primarily responsible for a new age of functional governance, but at the same time, he didn't have a strong control over the local population, which is why when he died in 1291, there was another period of instability, which led to the rise of Ğazan. You can see him on the left-hand side. And Arghun was particularly known for the fact that he appointed one specific vizier, Sa'ad ad-Dawla. You can see sort of a picture of what he would have looked like. It's not Sa'ad ad-Dawla himself, but you can sort of, yeah, that's what a vizier would have looked like. And Sa'ad ad-Dawla was a Jewish man. He managed to convince Arghun to promote him because of his knowledge of medicine. He was able to cure Arghun of a very simple disease. And he also spoke several languages and was very familiar with events going on throughout the Khanate, which is why he was appointed to that chief vizier position. As was typical, Sa'ad ad-Dawla promoted Jews and Christians, especially those Jews in his own family, to positions of authority within the Ilkhanate. And since Arghun was a Lamaist Buddhist, the power of a Jewish man over large numbers of Muslim subjects didn't bother him in the slightest. He had the Mongol toleration for people of all faiths and all religions, but that was not the position of the majority of the people. So when Arghun fell sick and was unable to protect Sa'ad ad-Dawla, a Muslim mob murdered him, and there began to be a large pogrom against the Jewish population that had done better while Sa'ad ad-Dawla had been the Grand Vizier of the Ilkhanate. Arghun died a few months later of the sickness that had otherwise incapacitated him. When Ğazan became Ilkhan, he tried to institute the Jiao Chao, which was taken from the Yuan dynasty. This was one of the first uses of paper money. And in the Yuan dynasty, it worked. China became primarily paper currency oriented. It's actually something that we know from Marco Polo as well. Paper currency was widely accepted and desired. In Persia, it did not work, and it in fact crashed the economy. Bizarre, as much as Ğazan would impose the death penalty for not taking this money, the majority of bazaars and merchants refused to accept paper money and would only deal with silver coins. This meant that Ğazan would be assassinated by Baidu in a very popular uprising, and Baidu himself would be challenged by Arghun's son, Ğazan. And Ğazan was able to defeat Baidu after Baidu took power after only a couple of months through converting to Islam and therefore bringing most of Baidu's Muslim soldiers onto his side. So this age of confusion where you have these four different Mongol leaders, Teguder, Arghun, Ğazan, and Baidu, was also the period with the greatest movement across the Mongolian Empire, this sort of Pax Mongolica, this general peace between the Khanates. As much as they were at war, there was a lot of trade that could continue to flow through these regions. So Marco Polo was, as most people know, a Venetian who crossed from Europe into Beijing. And so the majority of his time is spent in the Yuan dynasty, so it's not really relevant for us, but there are some things that he did that are, right? As a Semeran, he was appointed into the court of Kublai Khan, and he performed a number of tax and administrative duties for the Khan. When it came time for him to return to Italy, Kublai had received a message from Ğazan Khan of the Ilkhanate, and Arghun had lost his wife. Unfortunately, she had died, and he wanted a replacement for her. And his wife, on her dying breath, said that his replacement for her had to come from the PBUH tribe, just as she had come from the PBUH tribe, which is a tribe in Mongolia. So only Kublai could send such a person, since those territories were under the control of the Yuan dynasty. It also provided Kublai a way to further cement the friendship and relationship between the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty. So Marco Polo set out with Kökçen from Beijing, and they decided to take the water route from Hangzhou to the city of Hormuz in Persia. The land route was generally unsafe, which is why they took the sea route in 1293 when they set out. But the land route was still traversable. It's just that you wouldn't want to take a princess like Kökçen through such dangerous territories the way that you would be willing to take men through those routes. When Kökçen arrived in Iran in 1293, of course, Arghun was already dead. He died in 1291. And so she was married off to Ğazan, and Marco continued his journey to Europe. Kökçen only survived for 3 years in Persia, unfortunately, and she died at the age of 22. But Marco's stories, of course, traveling through the Ilkhanate on his way to China and on his way back from China, really gave sort of a sense of what Persia was internally from a European perspective. But Marco Polo wasn't the only traveler, and so we have travelers from the other side as well. You have Rabban bar Ṣauma, who you can see in the picture there. Now, Bar Ṣauma was a Ungud, which is a Mongol tribe, but he was a Nestorian Christian. He was converted to the Assyrian Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, and he set out with his pupil Marcos on the desire to see Jerusalem. And he made a number of trips before he got to the Ilkhanate, but once he got to Baghdad, he was stopped by Arghun, and he was basically told that it would be impossible for him to go to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was controlled by the Mamluks, and the Mamluks would not allow people from the Ilkhanate to go there. So instead, Arghun charges him with creating an alliance between the Ilkhanate and the Frankish kingdoms of Western Europe to perhaps start another crusade to fight against the Mamluks and perhaps secure Jerusalem. Arghun always put the possibility of the Crusaders recovering Jerusalem on the table as his willing concession to the Crusaders if they would help him defeat the Mamluks. Now, Rabban Barsauma went to a number of places in Europe. The first one was that he arrived in Constantinople, and he thought the Hagia Sophia was one of the most amazing structures he'd ever seen. He tried to get Andronikos Palaiologos, who was the current Byzantine emperor, to provide soldiers and create this alliance with the Ilkhanate, but there were a lot of internal issues within the Byzantine Empire, and so they could not commit. I have a question in the comments asking whether the writings of Rabban Barsauma exist, and they do. They have been translated into English. I think about 80 years ago they were translated into English. And so just you can look it up and you can read about all of his trips and where he went. And I'm just giving a summarized version, like the Tales of Marco Polo. It is a book, and yeah. So after he left Constantinople, he went to Rome, and he met with cardinals. They were at that time choosing a new pope, and so he left. So while in Rome, he was actually asked by the cardinals to say questions about his faith, which was not his mission, right? Barsauma's mission was one of diplomacy. So he tried in the most nuanced way possible to avoid the doctrinal disputes between the Nestorians and the Roman Catholic Church. He eventually made his way to France and to Angevin France, right? France being the one ruled by the French people, and Angevin France being the part ruled by the English. And he got a warm reception from both Philip IV of France and from Edward I of England, but neither of them could immediately commit to another crusade. Eventually, on his way back, he met with Pope Nicholas IV and performed the Nestorian Eucharist in Rome. The cardinals saw it, and while they couldn't understand the language, they could understand the ritual. And so they finally acknowledged that he was a Christian in every sense of the term. He finally, though, was able to return to Baghdad, where he lived out the remainder of his days with his former pupil Marcos, who had become the chief of the Nestorian Church in Baghdad. One of the interesting things is that we have correspondence between Rabban Barsauma, between Arghun and the various kings of Europe. And so, for example, we have this letter that was presented to Philip IV of France to try and create an alliance. And it still has the Mongolian seals, which are built in the Chinese style of making authoritative seals, and the Mongolic writing, which goes from top to bottom and is based on the Syriac script.
So, Richard, the question, why was a pope trying so hard to establish the connection with Mongols, and was he expecting then, have kind of like an exchange of ideas, or maybe even a help for that reason?
It was the other way around. The Mongols were trying to establish a connection with the Christian kingdoms. The Christian kingdoms didn't understand what the Mongols were, to the extent that they realized the Mongols weren't Muslim. Some of them thought they were Christian, but of a strange type of Christian. And they had sent Rabban Barsauma to Europe specifically because Rabban Barsauma was Christian, and therefore they felt that he would have an easier time communicating with other Christians. Rabban Barsauma himself was surprised by how unidimensional, in his view, the Christians of the West were, in that they only accepted Catholicism, that they had no understanding of religious diversity, because, of course, he grew up in an area where people were Muslim and Buddhist and Taoist, and all these different faiths all existed, and people just had these faiths. It was just a natural part. And even within these larger categories, you had a lot of different subcategories, and all of them were part of the fabric of society that these Catholics were so one-sided in their perspective was really surprising to him.
Interesting. So it's interesting is in Russian, a lot of the Russian literature, basically Nevsky, for example, who defeated the Teutonic Knights, was explaining when he was going to Karakorum, he would find an Orthodox churches there, Catholic churches there within this, yurtas, I guess, was set up as churches. It's just funny how the integration within the capital of the, well, at that time, I don't know what you would call it, I guess, the Mongolian Empire, they had so much respect for other religions. It was unbelievable, and that's probably stems from them receiving this Marco Polo, and they say Marco Polo made up a lot of the stuff. In fact, he came up with all his writings when he was in prison in Venice, and it was at these dying last wars, basically.
Well, no, there's a lot of stuff about how Marco Polo could not have been to China because there are a lot of things that he doesn't mention that a lot of people who've been to China, it's the first thing that hits them. For example, he never mentions the Great Wall, he never mentions tea, he never mentions chopsticks. But the thing is that all of those things would have been things that would not have been that obvious to him. The Mongols didn't drink tea and didn't use chopsticks to eat. And the Mongols also had destroyed most of significant sections of the Great Wall. The Great Wall that we have today was built after the Mongols were ejected, specifically to keep them out of North China.
Right.
So
he does mention Kaifeng Jews for interesting fact.
Marco didn't mention them. The first mention we have of the Kaifeng Jews is from Matteo Ricci, who was a Jesuit priest about 2 centuries later. But the things that, but there are a lot, and there were a number of things that Marco Polo did mention that people sort of scoffed at, but modern archaeology is generally proving him right. So the more time passes, the more it seems like Marco may have overstated some of his qualifications, some of the things that he did, a little embellishment here and there. But in terms of providing a relatively accurate portrait of what China was during the Yuan dynasty, it's relatively accurate. And Rabban bar Ṣauma, if I can be so bold, is even more accurate.
Yeah, at some point, I do want to review Marco Polo series. We're doing Gladiator this Sunday, but I want to do Marco Polo series at some point. So this is going to come handy.
Richard, I have a question.
Sure.
Name Rabban bar Ṣauma sound Jewish.
Yes. His name is a Syriac name, and the Syriac language. And the Syriac language is a medieval form of Aramaic. So that's why it would sound like a Rabban, of course, is similar to rabbi, right? Teacher. Bar is actually, bar we have in, bar, right? We have in for the term bar mitzvah, but bar in bar mitzvah is not Hebrew. Bar is Aramaic. It means son, right? Son in Hebrew is ben. So that's where the bar comes from. And Ṣauma in Hebrew is sum, fasting. So the teacher, son of fast, if you really want to translate it literally, but that was his name as a Christian.
Okay, thank you.
So now we get to Ğazan. As we mentioned, Ğazan took power. He was Arghun's son, and he took power by converting to Islam. You can see his conversion. And after he converted, the majority of Baidu's troops defected to Ğazan because they were Muslim too. So what was a liability about 10 years earlier for Teguder, being Muslim and therefore alienating the Mongol court, was a benefit to Ğazan. It shows how the trajectory of the Khanate had gone. And as a Muslim, he began to fight the Buddhist Bakshi, who were the Buddhist leaders that had come over when Arghun and others were in their more Lamaist Buddhist phase. He removed them from government and began to put Muslim leaders in charge, especially Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, who we're going to talk about in a bit. He was also a huge supporter of investing in science and technology, arts and mathematics, and he was an avid studier. He spoke several languages, and he was somebody who was able to combine the two major skills of running a Persian state, right? Because we've seen this with from the time of the Seljuks onwards. The Persian Empire was divided between the military Turkic classes and the bureaucratic, aristocratic Persian classes, right? That you had these two groups, the military and the administrative. Ğazan was an effective military commander and was effective at administering, which led to the creation of a golden age in the Ilkhanate. Now, when he converted to Islam, at least in the first 2 or 3 years, he was a very pious zealot in the sense that he was exclusivist. He began to destroy a number of the Buddhist monasteries, and he destroyed a number of Christian churches. But after a few years, he realized that this technique was not terribly effective. And so he rebuilt a number of Georgian and Armenian churches. He rebuilt relations with the Nestorian leadership in Baghdad. And moreover, he created a level of religious toleration similar to that of his predecessors while being a Muslim. At the same time, his conversion to Islam did not mean that he would abandon the typical Mongol enemy, being the Mamluk Sultanate, right? And so he invaded the Mamluks in 1299. You can see sort of where the border is, more or less, that sort of slashed line. He crosses the border and takes Aleppo in 1299, and then he moves south and wins a battle near the city of Homs called the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar, which is successful, but he's unable to consolidate these gains. In 1303, at the Battle of Marj Safar, the Mamluks retaliate and destroy the forces arrayed by Ğazan. Now, there were also crusaders in this territory. They had made the amphibious invasion from Cyprus. They had no, because by 1291, Acre had fallen, so they had no land-based territories in the Holy Land, but they tried to coordinate with Ğazan in terms of their attacks on the Mamluks. But by 1303, when Ğazan had fallen, so did the Crusaders. And it became very clear that the Mamluks would retain their holdings in the Levant region. Now, another thing that Ğazan did is that he reformed the tax system. And he reformed the tax system based on the words of Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani. So it's important for us to take a second to talk a little bit about Rashid ad-Din. Rashid ad-Din was born Jewish as well, but he converted to Islam at the age of 30. His family were Jewish apothecaries, and he had come into the service of Ğazan also through treating him for a medical ailment. Rashid ad-Din, in addition to being the Grand Vizier, and we're going to talk about some of the things he did as Grand Vizier, he did one of the things that is the most important probably of his life, which is that he created this book called the Jami' at-Tawarikh, the Compendium of Chronicles. And this was probably the most ambitious historical work in terms of the scope of its coverage, other than the fall of the rise and fall of Rome by Edward Gibbon, right? We're talking about a book that tried to span the entire history of human civilization and development. And he pulled from numerous sources in dozens of languages with hundreds of translators to help him navigate the sources. Now, of course, he spoke several languages himself, but there were a number of languages that these sources were in that he was not familiar with. So he needed the assistance to compile that. If you look at the picture in the upper left-hand side, you can see that you can probably recognize this picture. This is a picture of Melik Shah, who was one of the Seljuk sultans. We've seen a number of these pictures, especially in our lecture 2 weeks ago. And all of these pictures come from illustrated versions of the Jami' at-Tawarikh. So these compendiums of history give us the clearest understanding of what happened during the Ilkhanate period, and also many of the periods before, like the period of the Great Seljuk Empire, because of how fractious the recordings were at that time and how difficult these sources were to access. In fact, many of the sources that he cites to no longer exist. And so the only form that we have them in is in Rashid al-Hamadani's redacted versions. Now, as Grand Vizier, he was primarily in charge of the tax system and the exchequer. So he was deciding where money went and how money got there. We have records of him in terms of what science and technology he invested in, what kind of administrative reforms he tried to work on. And of course, he touts himself as being the savior, economically speaking, of the empire. But while that may be a little overstated, he did really change the economic practices of the country. One of the things that you may remember is during the reign of Sultan Malik Shah, you had Nizam al-Mulk. You can see the smaller picture of him in the lower right-hand side. And Nizam al-Mulk was the Persian bureaucrat that worked with the Seljuks to create the Iqta system. The Iqta system being that division and parceling of land as a way for the landless nomadic people to have a way of deriving rents from the land without pillaging. So Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, of course, had come from this sort of society that was familiar with the Iqta system. And so he introduced Ğazan to it and led to him giving many Mongols in his service these Iqta, these feudal pieces of territory, in order to raise revenue and create long-term wealth. It was difficult at first for Ğazan to sell this sort of sedentarism to the Mongols. And there's a famous speech that he had where he said, if it would be better for me to pillage and kill all the population of Persia, I would do it. But this is a more effective way. So Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani was around for all of Ğazan's reign and through the reign of his successor, Öljeitu. And so many of the reforms that he made really only came to fruition during the reign of Öljeitu. So Öljeitu was, in terms of his religion, a person who changed his mind many times in life. He was raised as a Buddhist, but in 1291, he converted to Christianity. But eventually he realized that the majority of his subjects were Muslim, and so he needed to convert to Islam, so he converted to Sunnism in 1295. But then he became flustered and fatigued with all the doctrinal disputes between different Sunni leaders and converted to Shiism in 1310. The main contribution that we have from Öljeitu, aside from his economic developments, were twofold. The first one is that he moved the capital from Margot to Sultaniya, which is a little bit further east, but still in the northern part of Iran. And you can see his tomb, which is still in Sultaniya. After that became the capital. And the second was that he fought a very long war against the Khartid Empire, which eventually resulted in a victory for the Ilkhanate, but a very Pyrrhic one that allowed the Khartids to remain independent until they were conquered by Timur. He also tried to create peace after sending a lot of correspondence to the Franks to try and create an alliance against the Mamluks. In 1322, he finally made peace with them. His successor, Abu Sa'id Bahadur, made peace with them in 1322 with the Treaty of Aleppo, and that became the end of the Ilkhanate wars with the Mamluks. Now, Abu Sa'id Bahadur doesn't really have much to distinguish his reign, and when he came to power, he executed Rashid ad-Din Hamadani, so we don't have a good historical chronology of what happened during his reign, but we do know that he died in 1335 without any successors. So we have this sort of weird situation with the Ilkhanate that they were doing economically well through the reigns of Ğazan, Öljeitu, and Abu Sa'id Bahadur, but because Bahadur had no successors, the empire just dissolved. And the thing that we have to remember, right, is that Ğazan and Öljeitu after him were developing these iqta, these tribal allocations of land. And so when the Ilkhanate government, the large-scale government, disintegrated, you ended up having all of these little baby khanates come into existence, right? You have a number of different states that developed from the various iqta that had been created during the reigns of Ğazan, Öljeitu, and Abu Sa'id Bahadur. All right. So as much as you guys would love, I'm sure, to learn about all of these different empires and drive yourself crazy, I figure that we should sort of move a little bit further in time, jump from 1335 to the 1370s in Central Asia to see what happens there. And there we encounter Timur. So before we do that, do we have any questions about the Ilkhanate, about its time, destruction, all these kinds of things?
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, so you are going to jump to Timur. So so you talk about 1335, the collapse of Ilkhan, okay, Ilkhanate. That means the end of the Great Khan tradition. No,
it's the end of the Ilkhanate, right? Remember that there were four.
Yeah. So you only deal with Ilkhan, right? You don't deal with the other, I don't know, the Chen.
Yeah, like for example, in 1335, the Yuan dynasty in China was still working. The Yuan dynasty would be overthrown in 30 years by
Ming dynasty.
By the Ming.
Yeah, by Ming dynasty. Yeah.
And
so,
yeah.
So right now the four so-called Khanates are separate. They don't, and you shift your focus on Ilkhan, not because Ilkhan is important. Just Ilkhan is important to your subject, not but not others doesn't exist, right?
Absolutely, no. So
okay,
of course, this is from the Middle Eastern perspective. So what's
I know.
Yeah. So if we want to take a look at the other Khanates are doing better than the Ilkhanate is from the perspective of they have more heirs. I have a comment about the Sarbadars. The Sarbadars were a group in Khorasan that were very devoted to belief and were willing to die for their belief, and that's where the name comes from. But the reason that we're dealing with the Ilkhanate is because it's in the region. The other three Khanates were much more long-lived. The Ming survived, as I pointed out, for another 30 years. The Chagatai survived for another 100 years, roughly speaking, and the Golden Horde survived even pieces until the 1600s. Like, for example, the Crimean Khanate, which was part of the Golden Horde. So the Ilkhanate was the first to fall, but it fell not because of revolts against its power, but because it literally didn't have a successor.
So okay, after the Great Khan tradition finished, the succession system become like to your son, right? The eldest son.
No, it was the Kurultai system, right?
So the Kurultai system.
Right. So,
but they are not doing for the Great Khan. They just do it for their own Khanate.
Correct.
Okay.
So it was a Kurultai, and in order to be eligible to be Khan of the Ilkhanate, you had to be descended from Hülegu Khan. And so Hülegu was literally just running out of descendants.
And but they have I think they are all descendants of the Genghis Khan, right? They all descended from the Genghis.
Right, but Hülegu is his grandson, and so in the rules of the Ilkhanate, you had to be a descendant of Hülegu Khan. It wasn't enough to be a descendant of Shinggis by a different grandson. You had to be descended specifically from Hülegu.
But that means Hülegu's great-great-grandson all die out during that time?
Yes.
It's not possible. They
Hülegu's,
all have
No, you're thinking of Shinggis Khan, right?
No, I thought about Hülegu.
Yeah, right. Hülegu ran out of descendants. There was literally nobody else left. They had killed each other off in civil wars.
Oh, but to the what's his name? The last one, Bahadur. Bahadur is the last one.
Exactly.
So Bahadur is the last one. There's no more to choose.
Correct.
And how many generations from the Hulegu to Bahadur? I think many generations though.
Okay, so Hülegu's son was Abaqa. Abaqa's son was Arghun. Arghun's son was Ğazan. Ğazan, I think, was the uncle to Bahadur. So, so 4 generations.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, for 4 generations. Yeah, yeah.
So
they all died in the war, in the civil war. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So if we move to Timur, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Timur himself as a person before we get to his imperial situation. So and the other thing that I want to, so I want to sort of put it to a vote, because I don't think I'll be done with Timur in 30 minutes. And I respect your time and I understand your time. So here's sort of my sort of question for everybody. Do we want to start with Timur and go until we hit the 2-hour mark and then finish Timur next time? Or do we want to just stop here for today and pick up Timur next week and we can do it completely?
How long is it going to take you to do it?
I would vote for doing it next time altogether.
Yeah, me too. I
agree. It's too much to digest.
Maybe we'll just
no, because Timur will take probably about an hour. Yeah. All right.
I
So
vote for next time.
yeah,
I like to have a fresh mind for Timur. Because I think
exactly. So a lot of people are saying next time, so I think that's great. Zach will just have to change the dates on everything, push everything 1 date back.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
And
I don't know how you talk this long anyway.
Oh, by
And
the
it's
way,
amazing how you can pronounce all these.
yeah, that's crazy.
I know, it's very impressive.
well, I was gonna say, Jason, if we start doing a lecture on China, you will find how quickly my pronunciation degrades.
well, that's why
we're just lucky that we're in a part of the world where I can pronounce all the names.
I think next time I'm going to give Richard a test to see how good he is. Your test question is so difficult, you know.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Maybe before you go, can you tell us what this 11 principles thing is?
sure. Okay, so one of the things that I hear a lot of people say, and it comes from a position of happy ignorance, for want of a better term, or blissful ignorance, is that Sufism is sort of this hippie version of Islam, something like that. And it's just
Awesome.
and it's not true. Sufism is mystical Islam in the sense that it doesn't follow dogmatism in terms of dogmatic doctrine as strongly as it does emotional connection and mental states. But that doesn't make it any more peaceful. Because that's like a different axis, right? It can be peaceful. It can also not be peaceful, right? Because emotions have the propensity to go to a very dark place or a very light place, right? And Naqshbandiyya is one of the tariqa or orders of Sufism. There are like 15 different Sufi orders that exist, and Naqshbandiyya was one of them. And Baha'u'ddin Naqshband, who was the founder of the movement, lived in Samarkand at the same time that Timur was beginning to rule there. And so Timur was very influenced by the Naqshbandi principles that Baha'u'ddin Naqshband put forward, which is why I have this here. And Naqshbandi is a Sufi doctrine that focuses very much on the mental state of focused motion, if we can say this. You have to focus on your act of breathing. You have to focus on your act of walking. You have to focus on your act of thinking. It is very methodical and organized in terms of how you are supposed to regulate your emotional sense and your awareness of time and your awareness of mental and physical activity. I have a question that is Sufism similar to Kabbalah? Yes, they're both mystical traditions. I would say that Kabbalah is different from Naqshbandi Sufism, there are Sufi doctrines like Mevlana, which we're going to talk about apparently now in 2 sessions. But Mevlana is probably closer to Kabbalah in terms of its orientation and how it perceives the emotional experience. But back to Naqshbandiyya. So Naqshbandiyya, because of its regimentation and organization, lends itself very well to militant movements as well. Now, of course, there are numerous peaceful Naqshbandi, and I don't want to denigrate them. The majority of Naqshbandi are not involved in military struggles, but Naqshbandiyya, as opposed to other Sufi movements, the only exception being the Safaviya, have a proclivity to be involved in military adventures because of this idea of regimentation and organization and thoughtfulness in motion. So, for example, I mean, if we go to today, Islamic State, some of their leading organizers were Naqshbandi Sufis. So, and during Timur's reign, there were Naqshbandi who fought in his armies and organized his troops for exactly the same reason. And it was one of the reasons I think that Timur really associated with them, is that Naqshbandi were this Sufi group that had this very strong proclivity towards their attributes being used for harmonized warfare.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Timur fascinates me so much. And recently, Rich has been there. I don't know if you ever reached his birthplace, Shahrizab's, but there's not a lot left there. But still, he interests me a lot. But you went to Samarkand, so I mean, there's so much of him left in Samarkand. It's maybe when next week we will do Google Earth, and then we will go to some of the Samarkand areas, so you guys get an appreciation.
Yeah,
what he built. And I think Uzbekistan did a pretty good job in preserving his.
Yeah, no, the only thing I would say is that the majority of the things like Registan, like many of these places were built by either Shahrokh or Ulugh-Beg, who were his successors. They weren't built by him specifically, but he did build a lot, and he brought a lot of wealth to Samarkand, which is why it became as big as it ended up becoming.
The only thing I wanted to say is the story. So there was this Russian scientist,
Sure.
Basically in June of 1941, June 20th, 1941, 2 days before World War II, basically ended up going into the tomb of Timur Lane and opening it. And Hitler attacked through the Barbarossa plan Soviet Union in June of 22nd of 1941, 2 days later. And it's interesting, on the tomb of Timur Lane, I don't know how true it is, it says 20 million people will perish. And exactly, if not more, 20 million Russians had perished. And Stalin himself called that same scientist to go and close his casket in Samarkand to end the war. And it was 8th of May of 1945. And the war ended the next day. So just, superstition-wise.
Yeah, no, the inscription on his tomb was, "He who disturbs my rest will suffer an enemy even greater than I." And of course, the Nazis are probably the only thing that could possibly be conceived that would be worse than Timur. So, yeah.
Not on a percentage basis, would they?
No, on a percentage basis, Timur was worse.
Yeah. And the Nazis lost their war. It's not like Timur died in power.
Yeah.
Not in control of as much territory as he wanted, but.
No, exactly. Timur didn't face any rival that could actually best him.
Or he was smart enough not to overextend himself.
Well, I mean, he died on campaign against the Ming. I think if he had fought against the Ming, that it would have been very close if he were to win. But I think by that point the Ming would have been able to hold him back. I just don't think he had the power of projection that far.
Yeah, Richie, as usual, this was incredible. Just wanted to go over the schedule pretty quickly for this week at least. Tomorrow we're talking about Islam 101. We're gonna have Narul and his friend joining us talking to, it would be a very short one, probably less than an hour. And we have over 100 people joining tomorrow. And then Thursday, join us for, changing gears, Macedonian War, First Macedonian War, against Rome, Philip V. And then Saturday, we're going to talk about Second Macedonian War. And Sunday, we're going to talk about the gladiator. Was it a myth? Was it true? How much of it was true in the movie? We're going to play clips of the movie, and we're going to point out a lot of the discrepancies. So join us. Sergio presenting that Saturday, Greg presenting Thursday. Hopefully, it's me. I've been doing a lot of presentations, so I would probably need a lot of help and discussions. But Richard was amazing presentation today, as usual, and I will change the schedule up a little bit.
Yeah, I was gonna say the schedule coming up will be the following: that the 9th of November will be Timur, the 16th of November will be the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome and the early Ottomans. But I think the title is Islamization of Anatolia and the early Ottomans. Then on the 30th, I believe, of November, because we're going to skip the Thanksgiving week. On the 30th of November, we'll pick up with the Ottoman growing pains, and then on the 5th of December, whatever that Tuesday is, that will be Mehmet the Conqueror, who was the one who brought down the walls of Constantinople. So after Timur, we're going to focus our attention on Anatolia, and we're going to sort of follow that ride through history.
Yeah. And then, like I said, if you guys want to present on any kind of topics, or you let me know, probably through this year, we're pretty booked up, but if you have something that you want to present, I know Howard is presenting the Third Punic War and Third Macedonian War on the 27th or 28th, I don't remember, but I'll put it in the schedule.
Yep.
Thank you for that. And so let me know if you're interested. I mean, Jason, if you want to do something about, Pacific and ancient China, we're actually starting with archaeology in Asia, or Bronze Age of Asia. It's going to be presented by Alex C. She said she wants to talk about the China and everything like that. So,
I mean, Alex C.
Yeah, she hadn't done presentations yet, but
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I
And
know.
if anybody wants to join in or has something to contribute to the presentations that I have coming up, or they have something that would neatly dovetail into this time period in history and wants to give a presentation, please do reach out. I'm more than amenable to bringing other people on, amending the schedule, changing things around. There was one person who was considering helping me out, but for some of the Turkish stuff, but he decided that he had other things to do. So.
Oh,
Yeah,
John.
I'll probably be happy to do it the next year, because this year I'm pretty booked up.
Yeah.
I'm so busy on many things. So.
No problem. As long as you guys join and participate, you're warm welcome to let me know if you're interested in anything. And so with that, I just want to wish everybody a nice evening, and let me know. Tomorrow, if you can join a little bit earlier, because once it hits 100, it's not going to let people in, and it's unfortunate, but I would need to at some point buy more, because the popularity is growing. So we're getting there. We're getting there. All right. Thank you, guys, and subscribe to our channel if you get a chance. All right. Have a nice one.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Right. Bye.